So welcome everybody to this seminar with Joe Roussos. Should experts be open and honest? Not only we philosophers, but also experts should be open and honest. So Joe started out in physics and philosophy at Witwatersrand in South Africa some time back. Then an MA at a place called Cambridge in physics. And then he started as a consultant for Bain. More or less like McKinsey, but maybe slightly nicer. And then he got back his senses and started working for a PhD from London School of Economics in philosophy with Richard Bradley and Roman Frigg as supervisor. Wrote a thesis on policymaking under scientific uncertainty, so it kind of connects a little bit to what we're going to talk today. He has published several papers in this area and similar areas, but also a very good paper that I always recommend, A Plea for Modeling in Ethics with Christer Byqvist. My favorite paper for irrelevant reasons. Anyway, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gustav. Yeah, so this talk is called Should Experts Be Open and Honest? And it's about all experts, scientists and philosophers. And the talk comes from this project that we have here, which is called Expertise in Crises. It's a VR-funded project, 3 years. We're into the final year, I guess. And the aim of the project is to theorize the role that experts play as advisors during times of crisis. So the project team is me and Eric. And the context when we were thinking about this, when we wrote the application, was really COVID-19 and the way that experts played this kind of increased and very public role as advisors, providers of scientific information. But I also do a lot of work on climate change, and so I use climate change as a kind of comparison case. And I characterize these two things as crises. And what I mean by a crisis is a situation that has roughly these four characteristics. It has really urgent decisions with very high stakes. Those decisions have significant degrees of uncertainty. And the situation on the ground is constantly changing. So the evidence base that you might want to use to make the decision, that's constantly evolving. So this talk is about one theme from this project, the communicative obligations of scientists when they're in this role as an expert advisor. And the particular thing that I'm interested in is a phenomenon of strategic science communication. And the basic setup here is just lay people often don't understand science. They find it complex and confusing. And when we communicate science, if we do what we're typically told to do when we communicate with other experts, which is share the detail, explain all the uncertainties and the caveats, that makes it more complex and leads to more confusion. Now, it used to be the case that people thought about this as a problem primarily for communicating with the public, because it was sort of the folk out there who didn't understand science. But now, increasingly, we see people in these senior positions of leadership, policymakers, politicians, who similarly don't understand or are actively hostile to science. So this is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., currently nominated to be the US Health Secretary. Kennedy is a vaccine denialist. He thinks seed oils are poison. He's also oddly opposed to pasteurization, so he thinks we should all drink raw milk. And so when scientists have to interact with people like this in policy environments, they face this temptation to communicate not directly just sharing knowledge and the facts that they have determined, but instead strategically, attempting to lead people towards desirable action. Now, more broadly, strategic communication is everywhere. It involves just thinking about the message, the medium, the audience, and crafting your communication so that it can be successful. That's not harmful. It can be, totally acceptable. It's a part of science, of course. When we think about whether, we've drawn a good graph or how to prioritize the key messages in the abstract, we're engaged in strategic communication. So that's fine. The kind of thing I'm interested in is the slightly more potentially nefarious version, where, especially when talking with policymakers, we attempt to get them to a certain conclusion, a set of beliefs or a set of actions, and we do that by deviating significantly from this sort of presumed standard of just telling them what we know. So the kinds of strategic communication I'm going to be looking at here are these three. The first one is minimizing uncertainty, or to put it another way, speaking with much greater confidence about some area of science or some claim than is actually warranted by the evidence. The second is obscuring disagreements. That's maybe, you can think of it as a subset of the first. Perhaps Eric and I really disagree on something, but when I communicate with somebody else who I want to do something, I mask that disagreement and we present a united front. A third version, which is a little harder to explain in the abstract, but I'll come to later, has to do with obscuring certain methodological decisions you've made or choices that you faced along the way, again, in order to achieve some goal. So let me give you an example from climate science to kick us off. One important question that climate scientists face is about extreme weather events like a hurricane. And the question is, did climate change cause this hurricane? Now, the underlying issue is extreme weather events are hugely damaging, they're very impactful on the people who experience them, and for people who go through them, and also for those of us who watch the news and see like the LA wildfires, they're amongst the most visible signs of the changing climate. So it's a really important question to be able to say climate change did cause this, or climate change impacted this event in this specific way. Now, broadly, there are two methods that climate scientists use to do this. The one is called the storyline method, and what it does is a sort of accident report. So it takes an event like the LA wildfires, and it looks at the sort of causal precedents. It looks at the weather situation, the dryness of the forests, and so on, and tries to account for how climate change boosted or suppressed some of those features. The fraction of attributable risk method, by contrast, approaches this totally differently. It does two sets of model runs. In the one set of models, there is climate change. In the other set of models, there's no climate change. It's a sort of alternate reality where we didn't ever do any of this stuff. And then they just look for how frequently this extreme event occurs in the climate change world and in the no climate change world. And then the fraction of the risk that they attribute to climate change is just how many more hurricanes like this you get in the climate change world. So quite different approaches to answering the question, complex methodologies behind each of them. And this has led to a debate in the scientific literature. These are two of the protagonists. On the bottom left there is Ted Shepard. He's the storyline guy. The top right is Friederike Otto. She's one of the main proponents of the fraction of attributable risk stuff. And in this debate, it emerges that the storyline method more often gives the answer yes. So it more often says, yes, climate change did contribute to this event. And Otto and co. said, we think you're communicating strategically. We think you like this method, and in some ways you've sort of set up the method to give the answer yes because you think it's really important to drive people towards climate action, and you know that extreme weather events are very motivating. Don't do that. It really harms us. It risks, lowering trust in climate science. And then the debate unfolded, and Shepard and co. said that's not what's happening at all. We think it's a better method, etc. The point that I want to just draw your attention to is that these are live debates that are happening even in what seem like fairly technical areas where the dispute is primarily about complex modeling methodologies. People are concerned with the strategic aspects of their communication and are calling each other out to say, don't do that, it could harm us. Or on the contrary, do it, it's really helpful, it motivates change. So, that's the topic of this talk. Should scientists communicate strategically? Primarily, I'm going to focus on an article by a philosopher called Stephen John, who argues against these virtues of openness and honesty and in favor of a certain kind of strategic communication. And I'm mostly going to be disagreeing with John, although I think there are areas in which he's correct. So, as I said, I'm particularly interested in these contexts of crises. So let me start with a little bit of scene setting to do with the early COVID-19 pandemic. So I want you to cast your mind back to sort of January, February 2020. This was a new disease, rapidly spreading. There was a desperate need for scientific information, but there was very little information available. We had some reports out of China. It was unclear how reliable the information would be. It was exploding in Lombardy. We were trying to get data out of Italy. What happened was research really stepped up and massively ramped up their production of scientific information. This was, I think, ultimately a good thing. It was necessary, but it also relied on a certain kind of reduction of some standards of science and a speeding up of some processes. So here's just some empirical evidence of this. This comes from a study based on a PubMed scan of articles published in 2020. What it shows is how quickly articles got published. So this on the x-axis is the days since submission when an article was published. In dark blue, in the area plot, you see COVID-19 articles. And then for comparison, they've put influenza articles in yellow. So you can see influenza sort of, it's a bit hard to see on here, but anyway, distributed all the way from 0 to 180 days. There are articles that take that long to get through the process to publication. COVID-19, by contrast, huge spike right near the origin. These articles were being pushed through this process incredibly quickly in order to get them out. And if you look at the dotted lines, which are the cumulative plots, you can see that about 95% of all articles in their PubMed scan were published within 40 days of submission. Now, if you're wondering about the volume of work, the volume is enormous. About 31,000 articles were published on COVID-19 in 2020, by contrast to about 4,000 articles on flu in 2020. You might suppose that there was some sort of transfer. Maybe the flu numbers were lower than they would have been otherwise. No, 4,000 is about the number that were published in 2019, 2018, 2017. So this represented an enormous addition to the volume of scientific literature, which really helped us to grapple with the pandemic, but also presented a certain challenge for people who needed to process this, filter it, get useful information out of it. So this phenomenon has come to be known as fast science. And as I've said, I think that it is a valuable phenomenon. It's just difficult to navigate the trade-off that it represents. So a useful entry in this debate is by the philosopher Jacob Stegenger, who says there's a trade-off here between the urgency of the crisis and the reliability of the information. As urgency increases, you need more information. You may have to sacrifice the reliability of that information. And he justifies this drawing on some political philosophy, Waltz's argument about the dirty hands problem in supreme emergencies. Waltz is initially writing about situations like war, and he says that leaders may be required to dirty their hands and sanction immoral acts in order to keep their communities going. Our situation is not so extreme. We're talking about scientists, but what Stegenger says is that scientists can violate these routine norms of science during periods when the lives of people are at stake, when they're immediately threatened, and when there's no pre-existing scientific information and no plan based on science to deal with the situation. So COVID-19 is an example like that. It was a new virus. We didn't understand how the disease worked. He says that's acceptable. What that leads to is what's called fast science, which is essentially a situation in which scientists are violating the norms of science, in a sense, in order to increase this throughput and generate more information. In what sense are they violating those norms? Well, they may be cutting corners, they may be lowering the threshold for sort of justifying claims that they would ordinarily hold to. They may be reducing the amount of scrutiny that takes place in something like a peer review process.
Just a clarification question. Do they do that openly and mention that they're doing that?
In some cases they do, yes. So to give you an example, Imperial College produced this famous report called Report 9 in the UK, which showed these very dramatic modelling results. Hundreds of thousands of people would die within a few months. This report, which wasn't peer-reviewed, was then basically fed all the way up to the UK cabinet and was used to justify their lockdown. That report was not peer-reviewed. They were quite open about the fact that they didn't conduct some fairly standard uncertainty checks. They didn't run sensitivity analysis on their model, etc. And in a public discussion of this, they said, it's a supreme emergency. We needed this information. We thought the stakes were so high and so many people would die that the ultimate priority was just on getting information to the decision makers. And what we needed was for it to be sort of directionally correct, where the direction was act now. So yes, they do talk openly about it. Perhaps not everyone, but certainly some do. Now, Stegenger says this shouldn't be anything goes. In fact, he argues for a kind of similarity principle. Essentially what he says is that the norms of science, these routines that we ordinarily follow, they're kind of normatively grounded. They are the way they are because that produces good science. So you can't just throw them away. In fact, what you need to do is vary from them only so far as is necessary to meet the needs of the emergency. So you need to increase the throughput. You really need to generate lots of information. Okay, bend just so far as is required to do that and no further, because you need to stick as close as possible to those good norms of science. I put in brackets here, this is sort of interestingly similar to this principle of Swedish kind of public administration of crises, also called the similarity principle, in which, as a rule of how to administer a crisis, people in civil service departments are told, try to stick as close as possible to how we ordinarily do things. In his case, though, it has this kind of attachment to the normative status of how science is normally run. Okay, so this is what's going on in the background. This is what's happening in the scientific literature. I'm interested in what happens when experts who act in advisory roles are now trying to take the information that's been generated from this fast science process and communicate it to the people who they are advising. And so the question I'm interested in is, what does that mean for their communication? And particularly, what does it mean for whether they should be open and honest about what's going on here, or whether they should be strategic in how they communicate not just the message, but also the sort of meta story of what's happening in science. So as I've said, I'm going to talk about this philosopher called Stephen John, who's a British philosopher, and he wrote in 2018 this provocatively titled paper, Epistemic Trust and the Ethics of Science Communication Against Transparency, Openness, Sincerity, and Honesty. He more or less says we should just chuck those things out. And he's talking about the communication of science primarily to the public, but also to policymakers, and he focuses on climate science. So it's close enough that it's a good starting point for my investigation. So I'm going to start off by talking about transparency. He treats transparency and openness as sort of the same thing, and then I'll talk about honesty. So in the paper, I talk about two different kinds of transparency. There's a discussion about whether committee meetings themselves should be open and accessible to people. I don't think I'm going to have time to do that one. So I'm going to focus on transparency about methods, the kind of fast science stuff that I was talking about. So to get us started, let's look at an argument from Stephen John's paper. And he, in presenting his argument against transparency about how science is working, asks us to consider a case that he calls enforced transparency, which is the ClimateGate scandal from 2009. What happened in this situation is that a group of hackers leaked emails from the University of East Anglia's Climate Change Research Centre. And this caused a huge furore because climate skeptics dug through these emails and they accused these scientists of engaging in anti-scientific behavior. And they highlighted three things that they thought were anti-scientific. They claimed that the scientists were inferring causation from correlation, that they were excluding certain data selectively, and that they were refusing to publish certain kinds of papers or papers by certain people. And so they used this body of evidence to paint a picture of a kind of conspiracy, that these scientists were acting in an anti-scientific way in order to impress upon people the urgency of climate change, effectively exaggerating the evidence. So this did significant damage. It was picked up in the media, and there were articles written about it in supposedly trustworthy newspapers. I cut off the header. This is from the New York Times. And a lot of the articles that were published were just journalists reporting in a sort of fervor about the excitement of this scandal. But some of it was actively harmful. This guy, Patrick J. Michaels, is a sort of known climate skeptic. He's one of these scientists who acts as a sort of agnotologist spreading doubt about climate science. This event gave them a platform to kind of trot out their standard lines about how this science was unreliable. As often happens in these cases, in the final accounting, it turned out that basically nothing wrong happened, but that gets lost in how people experienced the event, and it was extremely damaging. It was particularly damaging for that year's round of climate talks, because it was a major topic in the news, and it became something that politicians and the scientists who were at these talks felt that they had to respond to. So what does Stephen John have to say about this? Well, he starts by looking at these accusations, and he says, well, if the scientists were not acting as they should, then the public would be right to mistrust them. It would be right that there was a scandal and that journalists were getting upset about this. But in fact, it was all based on a kind of misunderstanding of fairly ordinary scientific practice. So let's look at the first claim, the claim that they were inferring causation from correlation. Of course, when we teach people statistics, we say correlation is not causation. But then if you ever end up doing causal inference methods, you sort of realize that causal inference does rely on certain patterns of correlation and the right kinds of tests of how robust those correlations are. And that, in fact, was what was happening here. It was standard causal inference methods. The second thing was that they were excluding certain data. This turned out to be a combination of fairly ordinary data cleaning practices and then slightly more controversial practices where there were sort of confusing sets of data that they didn't know how to account for, and they excluded them from certain models in order to retain the kind of coherence of the project while continuing to study what was going on with those data. The final one, I guess, is more sort of sociological. They were, in fact, refusing to publish certain kinds of articles by agnotologists and quacks, and some journals had just banned people because, it gets a bit irritating eventually. And I think that that is of a slightly different kind, but it is fairly standard. They are doing the thing that we would expect of them. They're defending the status of their profession, its ability to provide reliable knowledge by gatekeeping its boundaries. So what Stephen John says is that what we learn from looking at this is that the controversy emerges because people don't understand science, because they have a certain kind of cartoon image of science which is easily preyed upon by bad actors. So the problem is that non-experts have false beliefs about which practices and methods are part of well-functioning science. So for example, they might believe that science is always open to debate, when in fact shutting down skeptics and quacks can promote scientific progress. That's not to say they should never answer those claims. I think his point is more, they don't have to always answer every instance of criticism from quacks and skeptics. So climate skepticism, he says, trades on this false folk philosophy of science, essentially a picture that people have of how science works. And the way that skeptics do that is that they trade on the gap between how people think science works and how it actually works. And what John concludes from this is that transparency about how science really works can harm trust in science. And therefore you shouldn't do it. That's where he's heading. So here's the mechanism of how he thinks this works. He says, consider a non-expert who, prior to the release of these East Anglia emails, was willing to defer to climate scientists. Because, and this highlighted part is his kind of account of how he thinks trust in science works, she believed that she should defer to claims which meet scientific epistemic standards, those are high standards, and that in virtue of the social institutions, climate scientists' claims were likely to meet these standards. So she believed science was good, and she thought that like universities, publishers, and so on, they worked well enough that when she encountered science, she could trust it. Assume the second premise was true. Climate scientists' claims were, in fact, likely to meet high epistemic standards. In this sense, then, the non-experts' trust in climate scientists was well placed. Imagine further, however, that the non-expert also held a false folk philosophy of science. In this case, even if the non-expert's trust was in fact warranted, it was fragile. Had she been aware of how the scientists reached their results, she would have removed her warranted trust. So his concern is essentially that people have placed trust in science. They're right to do so in some objective sense. The machine is working. They just don't know how the machine works. So when they're shown how it works, they stop trusting science. Okay. Now notice there are two things going on here. There's his account of how trust works, and then there's a kind of empirical claim that this is what will happen. People will stop trusting science. And what he concludes is exposing the truth can undermine trust, and so we should do something else instead. We shouldn't feel pressed to just always transparently communicate about methods. Instead, when we make claims about what experts should do, these claims about experts' communicative obligations towards non-experts should ultimately be grounded in claims about what will further the non-experts' epistemic interests. So I call this a kind of paternalist norm. He says we should look out for them. these benighted people who don't understand how science works. We have to look out for their best interests and strategically figure out what information will get them to the right beliefs. And so the implication is when giving advice, you sort of have to hide how the sausage is made to avoid disrupting this kind of fragile trust. And he acknowledges that that's a bad thing. Like we should, philosophers of science should teach people how science really works, and methods courses should help to spread the good news. But there's no time for that. We need climate action now, so we need to hold on to the trust that we have. And I think you can plausibly see how this would just run the same way for the COVID-19 case. You're in this kind of extreme situation of crisis. The science is even more messy than normal. Do you really want to try and teach people what the sort of actual functioning of science is like, or do you just want to hold on to the trust that you have? Okay. So now, what do we make of this? What do I make of this? I think he's probably right that there are these folk philosophies of science, and I think that they exist because ordinarily science is kind of high status but low interest. People think that it's cool, but they don't know how it works, and it doesn't matter. So it's fine for most people to have a kind of cartoon view of science as arcane and complex, and if they know something about it, it's captured in some sort of slogans about science. But crises, I think, are different. That's why this climate gate incident occurred, because there was increasing attention on climate change throughout the 2000s that drove media and public interest. It also drove this wave of agnotology. And so I think that this kind of situation is not, in fact, going to work the way that John thinks it's going to work. So there are two things that I'm concerned about. The first one is, I think that there is an underlying empirical claim that, in fact, people, when they see how science works, will reduce their trust in science. The evidence that Stephen John is working from is that the negotiations went poorly and that there was a media furore about this, which is not the same thing as having actual evidence that people as a whole, their public trust in science decreased in response to this event. The second thing is that I'm not convinced that this strategy would work, that even if it were true that trust would be decreased in this way, that obfuscating the methods of science would be helpful. So first, what does the empirical literature say? I'm not going to go through this in great detail because it's quite complicated, but broadly speaking, empirical researchers on trust in science don't think this at all. And I can give you just a simple example. If you believed what Stephen John thought, then you might think that in Sweden, where we had a highly controversial response to the pandemic, we had lots of reporting on science, we had scientists doing and saying quite embarrassing things, we had models which had false predictions, etc. You might expect that trust in science would have decreased, according to John's model. That's not what happened. So these trusts come from Vetenskapen Allmänhet's annual Trust in Science Barometer. This is the 2021 version. This version on the left compares the number of people answering very high or quite high trust in researchers working at universities or companies. And as you can see, it remained very high. The last two data points are 20 and 21. So it in fact increased from 19 to 20. The graph on the right-hand side breaks out the subcategories just of trust in researchers at universities. And I'm showing you this because these are the two categories for very high and quite high. And in fact, the number of people who had very high trust in science increased through 20 and 21. So this result would presumably be extremely surprising to Stephen John, given that there was much greater scrutiny on science. People learned what epidemiology was, what models were, how they happened, and saw them going badly. But I don't think that empirical scholars of trust in science would find that failure surprising, because their picture of trust in science is much more complicated. It involves things like people's political leanings, some psychological characteristics of them, and crucially, the extent to which the science is already politicized. And those features can mask entirely the effect of revelations about scientific method not looking like what you thought it did. The second question then is, even supposing that trust in science did work the way that John says it would this strategy succeed, the strategy of obfuscating methods? So again, recall we're in a crisis. There's increased contact with science, increased reliance on it, increased scrutiny. I think that the strategy is just unlikely to succeed specifically in those conditions, because you're attempting to obfuscate just when people are watching. And if it has the flavor of a cover-up, this is likely to make it backfire. And this was one of the features of the ClimateGate situation that I think made it much worse, which is that the scientists at the University of East Anglia, panicking at this sudden frenzy of media attention, attempted to block their freedom of information requests and tried to not disclose all of the information that they had available. And that itself then caused much more negative attention. Now, Stephen John recognizes this. He sort of partially concedes it. He says, practices of opacity may themselves be a source of fragility, in that, were they discovered, they would seem to provide non-expert audiences with a reason to doubt the expert's claims. As in politics, it's the cover-up, not the original misdeed, which creates mistrust. But then he has this sort of spin. He says, these facts suggest an important twist. There are considerations in favor of openness and transparency. These do not stem, however, from some basic ethical demand. Rather, they arise from the same considerations which imply that we should reject openness and transparency. What he means is, it's because we are sort of paternalistically looking out for them and considering the consequences of what would happen if we communicated in these various ways that we might say, in some circumstances, if they, poor fools, think that openness is a part of science incorrectly, then we, from our privileged position, might decide to be open in order to not disrupt their fragile trust in science. So I'm interested in these advisory relationships where I think that this just kind of misses what's wrong with this kind of obfuscation. Because the relationship between advisor and advisee is often a personal one. It's built on mutual trust, respect, and a clear understanding of roles. In particular, the role of the advisor is to help the policymaker who is in charge, who's the person who makes the decision. And this kind of paternalism involves taking control. It's the exercise of epistemic power over the advisee by crafting their experience of the information, what they learn about, how much they know. The issue isn't false philosophy of science. That's not what's wrong when policymakers reasonably object to this. The nexus question isn't, are they incorrect that openness is a practice of science? It's whether this obfuscation might violate the relationship of trust between advisor and advisee. So, here's my overall take on this. I don't think that transparency of method is a very high priority. I don't think we have to go around showing how the sausage is made everywhere. There's no particular reason to push this information upon people, but it may be inevitable during times of crisis when there is such heightened scrutiny. And I think John's strategy of deliberate obfuscation is just likely to backfire. Partly for the reason he says, most people expect openness from scientists. They might be wrong about whether that's always a good thing for science, but that's sort of irrelevant. But primarily because in these advisory contexts, obfuscation is going to violate the norms of that advisor relationship. And I think that those personal relationships are precisely what's needed to navigate the confusion of the false folk philosophy of science. Because if you have a personal advisory relationship with somebody as a scientist, and they say, gosh, I really thought that you guys took all the data into account and correlation wasn't causation and so on, you, within the environment of trust and the kind of grip that you have on them, can potentially help them to navigate through that. You certainly cannot do that if you violate their trust and they begin to see you as working against them and attempting to exert influence over them in a way which is inappropriate. So my take on this is essentially, he might be right about the false folk philosophy of science stuff. That's no reason to engage in deliberate obfuscation. Part 2 then. What about honesty? As John gets deeper into the paper, he says, well, maybe all these concerns that people articulate in terms of these other virtues, sincerity, openness, transparency, are better understood as calls for a kind of honesty. He thinks that people are concerned that scientists should acknowledge rather than obscure epistemic uncertainty. And so they should be honest in the sense that they make hearers aware of the limitations and alternatives to their claims. So the question is, should scientists be honest in this particular way, honest about their uncertainty? Now, the trouble with uncertainty communication is that famously people really don't like uncertainty. And there's a widespread belief that policymakers and politicians in particular dislike uncertainty. A belief which is supported by them in many cases. So there's a famous story of the US President Harry Truman saying that he wanted to be sent a one-armed economist because he was really tired of hearing economists say, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand that. And what this is kind of communicating is a sort of general feeling that this complexity of expressing the way in which science often leaves multiple options on the table is just not something that people are set up to deal with when they're trying to make policy decisions. So there's a concern that if we give them all this additional information, it'll lead to inaction for a variety of reasons. So one, maybe they just can't understand it, and it's going to cause even greater confusion, which is going to lead to worse outcomes. And again, that might sound sort of rude, but I think that there were often instances where we had good reason to think that the policymakers that we're interacting with really struggle to understand the scientific information we're trying to provide, especially when it's presented in a complex way. The second reason is slightly different. It's just that when you communicate uncertainty, and there's a lot of uncertainty, it might leave too many options on the table. You're trying to decide, should you close schools or not close schools? Should you encourage people to wear masks or not? If the answer to each of those questions is, well, we're super uncertain, we don't know how masks work yet in response to COVID-19, then it's not clear to you whether you should encourage masking or not, and you may be paralyzed because you feel that there is no way to navigate the choice that you face. A third reason then is, again, this bad actors reason. It's a sort of classic part of this literature that one of the things that people who are interested in preventing climate action do is that they exaggerate, they increase uncertainty, and they use that uncertainty to motivate inaction or, in fact, harmful action. So many scientists are cautious about sharing uncertainty. And what John is doing in this portion of his paper is basically saying, yeah, they're right, they shouldn't do that. And the way he does that is through a sort of modified version of the parable of crying wolf. So he says, consider a shepherd who's newly appointed to her role. And unfortunately, because of the bad job of the previous shepherd, the villagers are just desensitized to cries of wolf. Doesn't matter who says them. If you cry wolf, nothing happened. One day the shepherd sees a wolf that's about to attack some sheep. And she knows that if she cries wolf, this will not lead the villagers to believe that there is a wolf there, and it won't lead them to act. She also knows, however, that the villagers will respond if she cries out that there's a band of wolves. By the villagers' own lights, they would prefer to correctly believe that the sheep are in danger. But they would prefer to believe that she thinks, even if it involved forming the false belief that the sheep are in danger because of a band of wolves, she thinks after the fact they'll be grateful to have had the correct response to the danger. So she cries that there is a band of wolves. And what John says is that this shepherd's calls are dishonest, but they differ from paradigm cases of dishonesty because her false utterance is trying to help them out, to improve their situation. And not just practically, also epistemically. She wants them to have the right belief that the sheep are in danger. So what she faces is a choice between making what he calls an honest assertion and an effective assertion. So she could assert honestly that there is a wolf, but she knows that that will fail to cause the desired belief. And so instead she could make a false utterance that there's a band of wolves, and the difference is that it's effective. It leads to the kind of belief that they themselves would prefer to have. And what John says is that the shepherd should prefer the effective assertion over the honest assertion. Okay, so why are we talking about sheep? I mean, what we're interested in ultimately is science, and specifically the application he's interested in is the communication of uncertain science. And the way that he takes this parable, the lesson that he takes from this parable is that when we consider how to communicate highly uncertain science, there's often a more effective statement we could make which drops a lot of this complexity and sort of drives straight towards the message. And he says that this is compatible with there still being an overall presumption in favor of honesty. So if the policymakers are diligent and they're listening properly and they're doing their job, then honesty is still the best policy. So don't freak out. In many cases, they should be honest. But in many other cases, what they should do is, instead of this sort of super complex stuff, this is a chart from the IPCC's assessment report, and it's making a fairly complex point. It's showing observations of how temperature has changed in black. There's a lot of variation, but you can see it more or less goes up. And then it's comparing it to two kinds of modeling. The green at the bottom, that's modeling in a world with no climate change. And then the brownish color that bends up quite neatly in line with observation, that's modeling in a world with climate change, with human-induced emissions rather. And the point of the chart is to say it's the human-induced emissions that explain the warming that we've seen. John says, you know what, you should just have a much simpler way of doing this kind of messaging. They don't need all this stuff. You want them to form the right belief, just communicate in a way that's going to get them there. Now he's trying to walk a difficult line, because he wants to hold himself back from saying, you can just lie to people to get them to do what you want. So he says, don't do that. You're not allowed to communicate false claims, creating false beliefs, in order to lead to good action as judged by the scientist. You can only do it, communicate false claims, leading to false beliefs, in order to lead to more important true beliefs. So he wants it to be within this kind of epistemic domain, because that's what science is about. It's getting people to kind of have the right beliefs, and it should be motivated by getting the kind of key messages into people's heads. So it's still focused on belief. So when you think about the wolf case, the villagers do have false beliefs because of the effective claim. They believe that there is a band of wolves. That's false. Okay, but that's in aid of this more important claim, the claim that the sheep are in danger. That's true. So he wants to walk this line about what kind of dishonesty is allowed. So I have two things to say about why I think this is wrong. The first is that hiding your uncertainty removes future flexibility. The basic problem is just, you might be wrong. You try to push the key message, but you're uncertain, in fact, and so your key message might be wrong. And if it is wrong, you're going to have a really hard time explaining why it's wrong, because you were so uncertain when you communicated it. Okay? And this seems like a simple point, but it's a mistake I think that people make fairly often. So there's an example of exactly this thing happening in the pandemic from the US. This is in the early months of the pandemic, so the first 3 or 4 months of 2020. At this point, there was significant uncertainty and disagreement amongst scientists about whether a mask-based strategy would be effective in reducing community spread. The uncertainty was basically because they weren't sure on whether the disease could spread through aerosols, and they weren't sure at that point whether asymptomatic transmission was possible. And the debate was about masking for everyone out in public. And so at that point, early 2020, US advisors could decide, should they neutrally describe this uncertainty, explaining that these were the things they were uncertain about, they didn't really know about masks, whether they would work, or could they think about the consequences and communicate strategically? And they chose to communicate strategically. They basically understated the uncertainty and came out decisively against masks. So you may not remember this, but in February 2020, Fauci, along with others, said, in no uncertain terms, masks don't work. There's no reason for you to wear masks. Okay. A few months later, the evidence had changed in their assessment, and they believed that the case now lay in favor of public masking. And so in April, there was a nationwide recommendation for people to wear masks. And unsurprisingly, there was significant resistance to this, because they had been told just 6 weeks before, in no uncertain terms, that there was no reason whatsoever for them to wear masks. And so I think it's really not surprising that when the new evidence came in that the scientists wanted to change their recommendation. That's what scientists are supposed to do. But it's also not surprising that people were not willing to execute an immediate about-face, given that they hadn't been told any of the uncertainty in the initial recommendation. A second consideration here again is about these personal advisory relationships, because there are two layers at which this could occur. The first layer, which is what's happening in the US case, is that the public communication hides the uncertainty. The second layer is whether the advisors, when they speak to the policymakers, hide the uncertainty at that step before it even comes to the question of what the policy is for the public. And here again, I think that there are significant risks in thinking in the way that John suggests. So once again, we have this kind of high stress, high stakes situation. We have policymakers that are working in these small teams that are under enormous pressure to respond to a situation in which literally hundreds of thousands, millions of people's lives may be at stake. And in that sort of circumstance, trust and esprit de corps is a really central part in ensuring a kind of coherent response. Policymakers often form these tight-knit response teams, and key expert advisors are integrated into them. So this was particularly true in the UK, and a political scientist called Kearney did this very interesting kind of qualitative study where he interviewed the advisors and the key policymakers and described how this kind of slogan that they were using, as we were, about being guided by the science, really meant guided by our scientists, the few who we have chosen and we have incorporated into our team and we have come to trust. So it was a small group of government science advisors, and the senior ministers in charge formed personal relationships with them. And he describes how status is assigned to these experts on the basis of a number of features. Yes, they cared about their expertise. They needed to be, impressive professors in epidemiology or whatever, but it was also assigned to them on how they engaged in the game of policy making, how much they aligned themselves with the government's policies, and how much they were willing to go with the way that the government was framing the problem. It also relied significantly on their willingness to play by the rules of the game. In the UK, the rules of the game are that debates are kept in-house, that in public you need to support the outcome of decisions, and you need to avoid public criticisms of government's choices, and especially avoid criticizing their competence. In particular, UK political culture has this feeling that it's a good thing if you accept short-term losses in order to maintain your participation in the long term. That's seen as being a sort of good chap who understands how the game of politics works. So in this kind of context, what do we make of the claim that scientists should be sort of dishonest and hide their uncertainty to push the key messages? This strategy that Stephen John calls well-leading rather than misleading. I think again the key message is that it risks destroying trust in a way that can be very harmful both to the advisory relationship and to broader trust in science. Because the framing of the advisory relationship in this kind of crisis management situation is that the expert is a crucial player on the team. They have a role which is to provide information that drives us towards good decision making. And well-leading is a kind of condescending approach that risks being seen as disrespectful. So policymakers might decide to do this to the public because there's a certain kind of paternalism, perhaps arguably built in to being one of those select few people who responds on behalf of everybody else. But they're very unlikely to tolerate it being done to them because they will then be put into that inflexible position where if it turns out that things are wrong, it's harder to change position, but they're being pushed into that position by somebody else. It's not their choice. Somebody's made that choice for them. And they aren't prepared for the possibility of failure because they've been told that this is the right answer as opposed to being told that there is uncertainty. So I think it increases the likelihood that the expert becomes essentially the fall guy who gets blamed for what failures happen. And I think that it risks damaging their trust in science as a whole. And this risk has to be weighed against the risks of bad actors, these risks of sort of agnotology, the climate skeptics, and so on, because the risks are not all on one side. So I think this puts experts in a difficult position. It's true that uncertainty is complex, that uncertainty makes life difficult, that policymakers want to be given clear answers. Truman did say he wanted the one-armed economist. But it's also true that attempting to hide information from them in particular ways such as by removing all uncertainty, puts the expert into a dangerous position and risks undermining the role that science plays as a provider of information to policymaking. And so I think a straightforward recommendation in favor of dishonesty is not going to work. There's a final thought that I want to end with, which is a sort of complication here. The picture that Kearney describes in this publication is kind of nakedly political. Right? He describes in the UK context that experts who succeed as advisors are ones who play the game. So what do we make of that? We, I think, often think of experts as providing a check on policy, as pushing it towards the right answer, as in some way speaking truth to power. And I think that what we learn from this research is that you can't do both. One person can't be both a trusted policy advisor who plays the game and maintains their position on the team, and a vocal critic of government policy. Now, we clearly need both of those things to happen, but I just think that two separate people have to do those things. So there needs to be, and this is more of like an institutional design question, which is outside the focus of this particular talk, there needs to be role for both the people who are expert advisors in the room trying to push towards policy that's based on evidence, and people who are outside of the room but have a route through which they can provide external criticism of what's happening in government policy making. Okay. So that's the end. Broadly, I'm against strategic communication as Stephen John presents it. I do think that transparency is a little bit of a mixed bag. There are forms of transparency that I think are good, and some that I think are bad, but this kind of obfuscation, I think, is dangerous and likely to backfire. And I continue to think that honesty about uncertainty is the best policy. Again, it's a complex picture. He's right that people don't like uncertainty, but I sort of think in a way that's too bad. We have to kind of keep them seeing as much of the full picture as they can manage and assist them in understanding it rather than attempting to hide it from them to push key messages. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. We get into the question and answer period. We will find a question from the floor, so you just put up your hand as you're ready done. And then people online, you write in the chat if you have a question. And do write both your name and field, since we like to file questions from different disciplines. You also allow for follow-up questions. Here in the room, you put up a finger. And in the chat, you write who you're following up to. And contrary to ordinary procedures, I will give the word first to Stefan Svallfors.
Hi, thanks very much for an interesting presentation. I have two comments or question. One is, taking this broader relation between experts and public policy into consideration, it seems to me that this framing about should experts be honest and open, it's a very kind of narrow framing, I think, of that relation. I think it has to do with a much broader set of issues, asking questions like when should you communicate, with whom should you communicate, how should you select and frame the things you want to communicate, through which channels, in which arenas, etc. Your way of framing it reminds me a bit about how journalists always frame their ethical dilemma, like should we always report on what has actually taken place, or are there other considerations that should make us refrain from reporting, or reporting in a specific format, etc. And then they always come up with it's always better to be honest and open. But the ethical dilemmas are much, much broader than that. How do you present your things? What exactly do you present from all the things that happen, etc., etc.? Well, you understand my point. And I'm not sure how well equipped philosophers and scientists from the hard sciences are to play that game. Because typically don't have that kind of disciplinary schooling. So that's my first comment. And my second comment is that I'm a bit confused by the starting point, both by you and by John starting from ClimateGate, because that to me is not at all a case of policy advice or science communication. It's a case of something else. I'm not sure what, but so that starting point kind of confused me. Thanks.
Yeah, that's. I think the first point is well taken, and one of the things I'm trying to do in the paper, which I sort of cut some context out, which maybe would have helped here, is to focus in on just a particular kind of situation, which is an expert panel, where the expert panel has a kind of the direct ear of a certain group of policymakers. And so I'm trying to narrow down a set of circumstances and then think about the questions in that kind of situation. One of the difficulties of this paper is that I am trying to engage with Stephen John because he has this quite helpfully crazy set of views in some ways, but he's a bit all over the place in terms of what he's talking about. Some of it is just straightforward public communication, some of it is this interpersonal communication. So I take entirely the point that it's too simplified and that it's not really possible to answer this question sensibly for all these different environments. I'm not sure that I understand the second point. So you think climate change, it certainly must involve some science communication.
I mean, it kind of involves some kind of involuntary communication where what was supposed to be backstage and suddenly became front stage.
You mean the ClimateGate?
Yeah,
right, yeah.
The ClimateGate. The starting point from that discussion was confusing to me.
Yes, so I think the point that he's trying to make is, look how damaging enforced transparency is. Doesn't that tell us something about transparency practices overall? But I agree that there's something suspicious in this maneuver because, as I say, at the end, it's not clear that it's a high priority to disclose all this stuff anyway. There aren't calls out there for great transparency about the inner workings of models. I mean, not generally, right? So I do take that point. And in the paper, I talk quite a lot about the sort of rhetorical device of using this as the framing for a broader discussion. Yeah.
Let me just quickly follow up to that, because I also wonder if things are a bit too coarse-grained. I mean, you're against, so to say, deception.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess it's deception that is based on the science part. So if I tell the politician, I'm going to come with this rock stars, if you come, I get all these politicians to come, but actually I didn't bring any rock star. That wouldn't be a big problem. So it's a kind of certain kind of deception that involves the core of science rather than other kind of deceptive things.
That's right. And the focus is to do with the role that science is sort of thought to play in policymaking, which is that it provides these, in the ideal picture that's a bit naive, it provides facts about how the world works, and that's required because the decision making can then be about this contest of values that's sort of the core of politics. But you don't want the contest of values to also be based on totally wrong facts, so you need some people who are just delivering that information. And then one of the concerns of strategic communication is if they begin to play the values game, it distorts that presumed relationship. So it's different to talk about scientists misleading people than to talk about being misled in general, because maybe you just expect other politicians, for example, to be misleading you all the time.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, Anandi.
Thank you. Thanks. I really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask, so I also got the impression that there was something a bit skewed about saying, contrasting openness, honesty, and transparency with the alternative, which is obfuscation, dishonesty, and non-transparency. That all seems like bad, right? So how could you not want to be open, honest, and transparent? But then I was wondering whether there's maybe an argument for the conclusion that communicating one's certainty is not always the best policy, but that does not imply anything like obfuscation, dishonesty, or non-transparency. And I was thinking of the argument that comes from something like the interaction between communicative norms in various contexts and epistemic norms. So as for communicative norms, one might think that there's some norm to the effect that one should assert that P only if one knows that P, or if one is justified in being that believing that P, or, there's some requirement on assertion that has to do with having a sufficient degree of evidential support for P. But then you might ask, when is that degree of support sufficient? And there's this view, pragmatic encroachment, which suggests that the degree of support from the evidence that's required for knowledge that P depends on the expected value of the outcome that is likely to be realized were one to act on the basis of P as compared with not doing so. So if the expected value of acting on P is much greater than the expected value of not acting on P, then the degree of support for knowing that P is low. So arguably, this might have been the case in regard to the wearing of masks during the pandemic, even when there was very little evidence that they would be effective in preventing the spread of COVID. The expected value of wearing masks is much greater than the expected value of not wearing masks, and so the degree of support is much less. And then in the case of communication with policymakers, well, you might think in those kinds of contexts, the degree of support that's required for knowing and therefore being justified and therefore asserting that P is kind of undetermined. The policymakers are the ones who decide how to evaluate the outcomes. So the scientists are not in a position to determine the degree of support that's necessary, in which case they need to be honest with the policymakers about that in order to determine what they may assert to the public.
Thanks. Yeah, I like that. I think that in this literature, people often talk about this kind of strategic communication as involving speaking against one's beliefs, or at least adding some distance between their kind of internal representation of the evidence and what they say. Whereas I take that, at least for the first part of what you were saying, which is maybe more about the public communication part, your view would be more that they in fact do believe it because the context is changing. I think that it's probably true. I'm kind of in favor of these broadly contextual ways of thinking about things. But I think that this conversation is often intended to be about a sort of separate next gap between what they believe and what they say. That's doesn't say anything against your second point about the policymakers, though, because I think that is a good point, that in fact they should perhaps, insofar as possible, not allow their own evaluation of the stakes to determine how they take the evidence and arrive at conclusions, but instead help the policymaker to do that by communicating the evidence to them and putting them in a good position to form those beliefs on the basis of what the stakes are. So, yeah, that's a bit of a sort of not a very satisfying answer, maybe. I mean, part of the answer is I'm participating in a literature in which it's presumed that a lot of this speech is kind of contrary to belief.
I mean, I think one thing, can I have a follow-up? I think one thing that is sort of lurking in the background of my question is the relation between outright belief and, credence or degrees of belief. And I guess often when we make assertions in ordinary contexts, we just assert our beliefs.
Yeah.
And the general view of speech acts or action is that it's just outright beliefs and desires that constitute our reasons for acting. And in these scientific contexts, I mean, it makes sense to think about the relation between the evidence and outright belief rather than thinking about it as determining a certain degree of belief, in part because, even if that's the right model for our internal mental states, we don't have kind of epistemic access to exactly what probability we assign to a particular proposition. And we generally just don't express that kind of degree of support unless we're, really uncertain. We might say maybe P.
Yeah, I take that point. I'm going to think a bit more about this. I think that there are a number of ways that you can arrive at the conclusion that people should not always communicate their full state of uncertainty. And this provides perhaps some of the resources to do what Stefan was saying, which is to be much more specific about the context, the situation in front of you, who you're talking to, what you believe about them, and so on. Yeah, thanks.
Eric. Wait.
Thank you, Joe. That was great. Very stimulating. I want to go back to a line from John where you said honesty and so on isn't like some basic rule of ethics or something, because that made me wonder what the normative foundations are here. What does he think the injunction to be honest, for example, is? Like, it appears from that line that he's thinking of it as some sort of categorical imperative. But like, nobody thinks that, right? I think what people tend to think about it is more like a virtue on a par with generosity or something. And you can recognize that generosity is a virtue, even though there might be exceptions, right? Some scammer calls from Russia, right? You don't need to be generous in the context. Or you can think of these injunctions as sort of rules of thumb that are justified on consequentialist grounds. But then, of course, the answer becomes sort of empirical in nature, and there's just like a ton of evidence that even like relatively slight exaggerations can have very negative consequences downstream. Like in the COVID example, some scientists were probably maybe exaggerating the efficacy of vaccines when it comes to stopping the disease as opposed to making the symptoms less severe. And that came back to bite them very badly, right? This comes up in like every anti-vaxxer discourse that I ever come across. Like, so
Yeah.
How are we to think about the normative foundations here, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, it's a little unclear to me. I think that he starts the article by saying that he thinks that people presume something like that these are categorical norms for science. Not for everyone, but for science. And that they are part of these... I guess there's this assumption that like science is made up of a method, and that method is normatively grounded, and then perhaps there is also similar sets of normatively grounded principles for science communication, and he wants to say these aren't them. But I agree that I'm not sure how many people thought that. And so that does set up a kind of problematic some sort of problematic dialectic in trying to reply to him. One of the things I've been sort of struggling with in the framing of this paper is he's a very kind of tempting person to frame it around, because this article generated quite a lot of attention because it's very close to the topics I'm interested in, but it's quite quirky, and I'm slightly unsure how much he was sort of trolling in. So it does make it difficult to know how directly I should respond to his framing of things. Yeah.
Very good. We're going to take a question from the online people, from one of Joe's foremost critics. Chiara, you're next. Chiara, will you put on your microphone and your camera? There. I don't know, it's not coming up there. But can you hear? Can you say something? We can hear you.
She's on mute.
Still on mute.
Still on mute.
Still on
Chiara,
mute.
you need to unmute.
Maybe I have to come back to her.
Okay, we're going to come back to you. We're going to give some reprieve to Joe and survive for a while more. And then instead, I'm going to go for, what did I have next? That's Aron.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm curious about this claim of John's that people have this sort of, I guess, somewhat stable folk philosophy of science that's operative here and sort of explaining what goes wrong when they encounter, someone with this adversarial spin on the ClimateGate leaks who's pointing out that, they've excluded all this data and isn't that suspicious, etc., etc. And the way I would interpret that is more like, okay, they're coming across this science stuff that they don't really understand. Someone has this take that they're presenting to them, and it's already, a politicized topic, so they have reason to be suspicious. Whereas if someone else prior to this had explained some of this data cleaning stuff in a different, like non-politicized context, I don't think that would necessarily like contradict some folk philosophy of science that they bought into, or sort of undermine their trust in the relevant science. So yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that sounds plausible. I suspect it varies a lot by person, level of science education, what they remember from high school, etc. I mean, I do think that in some of this literature which empirically studies what people think about science, people do have a picture of science in mind. And when I say people, I mean, I guess, again, it's going to vary by geography, by education background, etc. But there are some people, I think, for whom they have a sort of vision of science which can be disrupted, and so they can feel like it is being let down by a certain kind of interaction. But I think you're right that there are likely other people who don't have any such stable view of science, and for them, those other considerations that I mentioned when talking through that empirical literature are just going to completely dominate. It's going to be about their political leanings, who they're hearing this information from, what context they're hearing it in, and so on. So yeah, I think that's right. And it fits into a sort of general problem with trying to do philosophy on this topic that's not kind of in direct contact with this empirical literature, that it's easy to form these overly simplified views of how everybody is going to respond to something. Yeah.
So then we're going to try with the online audience again. Promit.
Thank you very much for putting on this fantastic event. I thought it was super interesting. So my name is Promit Anwar Westander. I'm an economic advisor at HM Treasury in the UK. I'm an economist with both of my arms. And so in thinking through this, I was thinking in our day-to-day sort of work, strategy is actually quite an important consideration. But at the same time, when one is strategic in their communication, either to the public or with politicians, I feel like that changes their reaction function in how to interpret the advice that we're giving, which in turn then would change the way in which we would want to deliver that said advice. Thinking about this broadly in game theory terms, it's not clear to me whether that would eventually lead to a good outcome, or whether you just basically spiral into people second guessing each other and moving further away from where you're wanting to get to. Given it's so difficult to know a priori, whether your strategy is on an optimal path, are there some heuristics that we can apply in how we approach our communication? It seems from what you're saying that avoiding deliberate obfuscation is one of those heuristics which are worth applying. Do you broadly agree with that? Do you think that there are any other heuristics that you would recommend? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think, it's great to hear perspective from somebody who's in it and also in the political culture that I was talking a bit about. I think that there's a real risk that you're identifying, which is that you end up through this series of loops in the classic and harmful kind of cheap talk situation where you just can't trust things that people say. I'm not sure I have other clear heuristics. I mean, one of the interesting things from the sociological literature of people who succeed in these roles, advisory roles, who work in regulation, for example, which is kind of distinct but has similar issues, is that it is the scientists who learn to live in this world and understand how to navigate it who can succeed. So in fact, that literature suggests, and this is not kind of normative, it's just a description, the people who do well are people who can forge a middle ground where they can learn to be political enough to understand those trade-offs, to recognize that there is this game where each side needs to figure out exactly what the other person is doing, and yet can maintain their status as somebody who is a provider of reliable information that's going to lead to successful policy. Because if you deviate too far from that, then you're just one more guy who says political stuff, and they don't really need another one of those. There are plenty. So I think that's the real challenge, is how to do that. So I will attempt to come up with some more neat heuristics, but I'm not sure I have one for you right now.
Happy about that, Promit?
No follow-ups from me. Thanks very much.
Just a quick follow-up then. I mean, you mentioned this, and we always hear this said that politicians don't like uncertainty, and this kind of doubtful Truman quote. Is there any good empirical support for this?
Yeah, I haven't. I'm not sure they have a specific study of politicians and policymakers in mind, but there are lots of case reports of people who have jobs, I suppose, like Promit's, where they describe their challenges in communicating complex information, and they often highlight uncertainty as a key challenge. So I don't have something that's on the realm of like a large quantitative
there are
study.
many different cases of uncertainty. You can, so you have some likelihood for this and some likelihood for this.
Yeah.
You have to choose. I don't think they have a big problem with that. It's going to maybe when it gets very complex. So it would be neat to have some kind of more qualitative study about what really is that they don't like.
Yes.
It's too broad a brush to say they
That's
dislike
true.
uncertainty.
So a lot of times when people describe this, what they mean is, and I think this is maybe the heart of your question, is that it's about statistics. It's really about attempting to convey the complex form of quantified uncertainty that we have told ourselves is not just good, but is the standard for how you do science. And then we move out of that context of communicating with other researchers, and we just use the same tools to communicate with politicians and policymakers, and that goes badly. In a way, I think that's not surprising that it goes badly, but I think that it is, and this goes back to what I said to Promit, it's about people who can figure out how to live in the world that they've moved into and not just bring those norms from academic research science.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be interesting? Maybe there is already literature on this and exactly what kind of uncertainty that is hard to communicate and which one.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, so there are people who do some of that. I mean, most of what I'm aware of, though, is focused on public communication, because there are these sort of science communication and statistics communication units, but they largely study things like how you get people in general to deal with it. So I don't know of anything that's policymaker specific. That would be good to find.
Oh, but interesting, fine.
Yeah.
Valdemar.
Thank you, Joe. There is a clarification, namely on the slide where Carney 2021 was mentioned. If I remember correctly, the quote was that these experts formed professional ties, but if I remember correctly, you said personal, and it's that they formed personal ties. And I wondered if it was that Carney writes about the professional ties or the personal ties, because he wrote it in 2021, and that was before the Partygate scandal, which involved some discussions about personal relations between experts and the then prime minister, and where he had been supposedly been. So he was talking in his article about the professional ties, or was he mentioning forming personal ties among experts and policymakers?
Yeah, so let me clarify that when I used personal, I didn't mean it in the way I think you are now, contrasting it with professional, the contrast being like you and I are colleagues, and then our personal relationship would be if we start like going out for dinners or whatever. I meant it more that the relationship is a one of individual to individual. They know each other, they work together in a way that's not the same as in some of the cases that Stephen John was considering, where it's about an expert body communicating in a very kind of mass way, like in the example of the US CDC telling people not to wear masks. So that was the contrast I was drawing. But to answer your question, he doesn't discuss that kind of personal relationship. And I think you're right that it's partly because it was before that. It's also probably because the way he framed the qualitative study he did, the interviews, was very much around the way in which science was used to drive policy making. So that's the kind of whole focus of the study. And he was interested in these claims about following the science, doing what the science says, being guided by the science. And so he starts from that question and then discovers, in a sense, that in fact, what was happening was they'd selected these particular individuals who they then formed relationships with, trusting relationships, etc. And and then all the stuff that I said follows. But it would be interesting to know if there were sort of follow-up studies after some of this other stuff about the more personal aspects of those relationships. I don't know.
Thank you.
Very good. Then we go to Felicia.
Yeah, I have a question about kind of roles in communicating with the public. I think, this point has kind of, or similar points have been made a little bit more sophisticatedly already, but it appears like the logical conclusion from your argument is that there needs to be like a clearer role definition between the public communication from experts versus policymakers or politicians. And I think that was something that also kind of happened during the pandemic, that in certain moments politicians kind of ceded communication to experts. So for example, with Tegnell and the issues of masks, he was kind of practicing, this like complete transparency and also kind of, I think, neutrality in his discussion of masks in like the public communication channels, which caused a lot of confusions. And I think it would have been fairly easy for policymakers to be, we have, this data, but based on the fact that, it's not a big infringement on individuals, while like there could be potential, like high positive outcomes, we are recommending masks. But instead it was kind of like the communication was ceded to the scientific expert, which is a person that should be more neutral and more transparent. So I was wondering if this is something that you go into in your paper or has considered as maybe a recommendation moving forward in looking at crisis communication, that this kind of role definitions needs to be clearer.
Yeah. So in part, the paper does make this argument that there are quite different norms for for communicating with the public versus providing policy advice. The Sweden example, I think, is an interesting one because there are sort of several things going on. One is that Folkhälsomyndigheten it's an agency that is in some way the policy maker, so they're making the recommendations. It's also a body which has its own expertise. They had in-house modelers. Tegnell is an epidemiologist, so the advising was sort of happening within the walls of that body in some of the way I'm describing it. But they're also a provider of information to politicians and a provider of information to the public. So in some ways, they're doing all of these roles that I'm describing in a way that is complicated. I do discuss in one place, I think, the importance of having outside experts, and there are several reasons for that. I mean, one of the criticisms that the Public Health Authority faced was that it was really a closed shop. They didn't engage very much with outside experts. They didn't make a lot of their reasoning open to the public. They weren't sharing their models, etc. And by contrast, the SAGE committee in the UK had this support structure where there were the people on the committee who were the advisors. They were talking to the politicians, and they were then supported by modeling teams who themselves were supported by these large networks of outside experts. And those people could provide challenges, they could do different bits of modeling, and then they could read all this like crazy mass of literature that I showed you, and they could try to filter information up. While I think the UK had a lot of problems in how they ran the pandemic, and in many ways did worse than us, that structure, I think, was much more effective at getting expert kind of contestation into their policy making process than what we had here, where they really just kind of knuckled down and did it themselves. Yeah.
Happy with that. Then we move on to the online audience. Ethan. Ethan should be somewhere. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can see you.
Hey, Jed. Thanks for the talk. I suppose I want to also add to this idea of the sort of folk science concept. You sort of speak about it, the sort of maybe the folk scientific method, but there's also maybe something to be said about the folk scientist, as though there's this like cabal of hardcore white coat wearing scientists. But I mean, is there not something to maybe be said about, you know, the people on the periphery of science that are like on their way to becoming experts, or like, you know, sort of work in science adjacent fields? And, you know, should we take their sort of epistemic claims seriously? Should we only be sort of considering things that come up through the established pipeline of, you know, big industry that have public relation teams and that sort of thing? Just to add to the complexity.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and we, I guess Anna is not here, but we have a colleague here who studied this phenomenon of kind of viral expertise, people who became experts not really because they had the credentials, but because they were good on social media and they provided people with information that, you know, they wanted at the time. I find that very interesting, and I have done a little bit of thinking about in what circumstances it's kind of reasonable or unreasonable for people to move away from just trying to get scientific information from the professor with the PhD, etc., and start looking at alternate sources of information. And one thing that I've considered is a bit like the Stegenga article about how the conditions of crisis might lead scientists to behave differently. I think it might be reasonable, if you wanted to sort of give a break to people who were taken in by these viral experts, to say at the beginning of the pandemic, they had a desperate need for information. They just weren't getting high quality, comprehensible science communication from the establishment. And so that created room for other people to provide information. And maybe what they were doing is they were lowering their standards, lowering their sort of threshold for acceptability to try and get more information. I think that's kind of understandable. It might lead them astray. It certainly did lead many people astray. Yeah, I haven't really sort of followed that thought through, so I don't have a lot more to say, but I agree that it's a very interesting phenomenon.
Cool, thank
Thanks.
you.
Daniel, you need a microphone. I don't know where the microphone is. There it is, close by.
Yeah, hello. I was wondering about the case of the UK, which you took, I think, as I mean, this particular example probably is like a negative example on was it honesty or and I was wondering, I mean, because in part I think your question has to be answered maybe also empirically, because I mean I find your arguments plausible, but in the end it's kind of involves psychology of the people that are involved with trust to the elites and so on, and or experts. And I think in the UK the trust in experts is very high. I mean, it's, as far as I know, it's higher than in Sweden, for example. And so I was wondering what you make of this kind of that you have both these like kind of seemingly bad cases, how they behave, and on the other hand these like high trust in experts in the UK.
Yeah. Are you thinking again about this Climate Gate case, the expose of?
No, I think it's hard to remember exactly which was, but it was about this when you mentioned that they take like experts sometimes as the fall guy or something.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's true. So maybe I should make a distinction then. So it's true that there's very high experts. When we say that, what we mean is in these large public surveys, like the one that I showed for Sweden, report having high trust in. And they usually ask the question as like researchers who work at universities or something like that, or science in general. The thing that I was describing was in that section where I talked about being the fall guy, was this political culture of being in the room, one of the key advisors who's talking directly to the politicians. That general level of public trust in science, I think, does not tell us very much about how that political environment operates. And instead, what we learned from looking at people like Kearney, who did this detailed study where he interviewed people, is that they are trusted on the basis of their expertise. That is a factor, but it's just one of a number of factors. And equally important is how much they play the game, whether they seem like they can navigate the sort of way that we do things here. And it's that package that matters. And so while it might be true that there's a generally high regard for experts, what Kearney's work shows, I think, is that that stuff can be swamped by this other stuff. So if you just don't know how to play the game, or if you go out and are very critical in public of the person who made a decision, who you advised on that decision, so you break from the team and you criticize them, you're out. Doesn't matter that they, in theory, trust scientists a lot, because the political culture doesn't tolerate that.
Thanks.
Good. We might have a question from the online audience, but there's a mic issue, so are you going to ask the question?
Sure. So the questionnaire Abhishek Tripathi comments that common people often believe that experts in government, I mean, as the executive, would solve a lot of issues, and do we exaggerate that expectation?
I thought, do we exaggerate the role of expert in public policy and governance?
Yeah. This is a question that I wonder about quite a lot. I think that in select moments, it's clear that experts play a large role. One of the reasons that I focus on situations like the pandemic is that it's clear that there was a strong appetite for scientific information, and that across a variety of different political systems, experts did play a large role. So in the UK, which we were just talking about, this advisory panel reported directly into the Cabinet Office, and I think their recommendations were taken very seriously. They implemented a lockdown on the basis of this report from Imperial College. In Sweden, things work differently, but I think there was a similarly impactful role for those epidemiologists inside the Public Health Authority. Now, maybe what you mean with the question, though, Abhishek, is like, are we vesting too much trust in them? Should we not look to them for the solution? That's a more complex question. I mean, in general, I think that policy making of all sorts requires good evidence, but that can't provide the answer. Experts cannot tell us what to do, because what we ought to do is a combination of understanding the way things are, how the pandemic is going to unfold, and then making a bunch of value judgments about what we want, what we prioritize, how the different policy options trade off one kind of harm against another. So experts can't solve that problem for us at all.
Very good. So if there are no more questions, Emma seems like she would like to ask the last question.
Oh, yeah? Can I? Okay, thanks. Yeah, it relates to previous people's questions, but I was thinking this idea that dishonesty or like this strategic communication can undermine trust over time, and then you give this example with Fauci, he was wrong, and then, the way I think about it in Sweden, I think Tegnell made some very assertive claims which were wrong in the same kind of way Fauci did, but then you show this graphic showing that Swedes were totally buying it over time. And so it seems that there's a difference between Swedes and Americans, rather than, it's sort of a pragmatic approach you're adopting, and it kind of shakes me up a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point. And in fact, I mean, it plays into the thing that I said when I showed the graph, which is that so much of what really matters is the degree to which science has been politicized, the political leanings of the people hearing the science, and so on. And so you make a good point that a large part of the problem in the US was that there the science became politicized, and in fact that continues to be the case in a way that's slightly bizarre to people who I think are not from that political context. So that's a good consideration. I mean, maybe I'm being too quick to say what happened with Fauci was that he hadn't left himself any room to maneuver, and then it was hard to do the policy about face. In fact, in line with what I say in a different section, perhaps what was driving it was instead this politicization. But I do think that one of the issues which was picked up on by the people who had politicized the science and who now were resisting wearing masks was, well, you told us 6 weeks ago that they don't work. And that's different from being in a situation where you told us 6 weeks ago that the science is uncertain and we do not currently recommend that you wear masks. So I'm, I suppose, making an counterfactual claim that I cannot support because it didn't happen. But I think that they would have had more room to maneuver. They left themselves some space. It's difficult to say why it is that we tolerated, so much from our scientists here, and were happily maintaining high levels of trust. One reason might be that it wasn't particularly politicized. It may also be that what people care about overall is not these kind of individual maneuvers, but whether they feel like the system is working in their favor, and that's a sort of classic issue in the US that people, I think, do not think that.
I'm sorry, did you show a graph on trust in science going down in the United States during COVID or something?
No.
So we don't have any comparison graphs between Sweden.
I don't have one.
So we don't even know that thing.
That's true. And the point I was making, I guess, in that section was not actually about trust in science. It was about resistance to a policy, which is a different thing.
That's the same thing. And secondly, I mean, you notice it's a bit complicated compared to Sweden and United States because there's a federal level and it's a state level. Yeah. Different politics going on there. So it's kind of a bit messy. And a lot of the fight was between the federal and state level. Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, then I think... we have Eric. Okay, go for it.
On that last point, so it was very interesting to me to see during the pandemic how in the US, like pro and against lockdown positions cut down along political lines, right? It was a left-right issue, which it really wasn't in Sweden at all. The research I've seen here suggests that the arguments for and against lockdowns and whatever cut more along lines of trust. And I mentioned this to emphasize that like what we're seeing on the graphs are sort of averages or whatever, but there was a great deal of heterogeneity in Sweden, and the relevant difference apparently was that people with a higher level of trust in the government, public health officials and so on, tended to forgive Tegnell his missteps and endorse the policy such as it was, whereas people who were low in trust tended to blame him and not agree with the policy. So it's important to look at distributions of trust, I think, as well as averages over time.
And I think that one of the difficulties of this stuff is that you have these virtuous cycles, or alternatively vicious cycles, where if you start at a high level of trust, you're willing to forgive, and then you can kind of maintain yourself at a relatively high level of trust unless something is sufficiently destabilizing. But if you're in the low level of trust, then you interpret many things as reasons to continue to distrust.
Note, we always come back to trust. Join me in thanking Joe. We have some great seminars coming up. February 19th, Daniel Waldenström, Richer and More Equal, A New History of the Wealth in the West, a grand claim. And he's a professor of economics at the Institute for Industrial Economics. March 5th, we have Åsa Wikfors, to be announced. She's a professor of philosophy. And then March 12th, we have Lena Wengerud, Why Women's Political Representation Affect Levels of Corruption, Trends in Bribery and Public Service Delivery Across European Regions. Professor of Political Science at University of Gothenburg. All welcome then.